Hello, good afternoon. This is Erin Frazier reading a chapter from her book, King, a True or False Prophet, with a question mark. This particular chapter is called Seducing Spirits. Now, therefore, behold, Yah hath put a lying spirit in the mouth of all thy prophets, and Yah hath spoken evil concerning thee. 1 Kings 22:23. A powerful phenomenon occurred during the Civil Rights Movement that caused people to have a strong emotional attachment to King and the things he advocated in an almost obsessive, unreasonable way. This was fascinating to me, so I wanted to explore the idea of seducing spirits in relationship to King's public ministry. The scriptures remind us that those who allow themselves to be seduced by false prophets and deceivers by abandoning the defense of Yah's word make themselves candidates for strong delusions. This is a horrible point to come to because blindness and damnation is what those, quote, who believe not the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness, end quote, will experience. 2 Thessalonians 2:12. The scriptures further warn, they that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy. Jonah 2:8. The thing that so many people take for granted is that demonic seducing spirits are real beings, even though we cannot see them with our natural eyesight. They are intelligent beyond human comprehension and know how to make contact with humans without humans knowing what has happened. They are able to do this through powerful suggestions presented to the mind. Everyone has experienced this, although very few are aware of it and the mechanisms involved. I discovered that one of the primary things seducing spirits do is mimic our natural voice and replay that familiar sound back to our mind, accompanied with their suggestions and ideas. When they do that, they also work to manipulate our emotions and feelings so that the package of suggestions they present are believed to be of our own making. Many times these suggestions and ideas are harmless in and of themselves, but what happens is that they are conditioning you so that you predictably respond to what you think are your thoughts until you are completely manipulatable. The only way to guard against this malicious assault on the human mind is to commit oneself to Yah's word and lean not to our own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Proverbs 3:5 and 6. We also cannot allow our minds to wander any and everywhere. We have power to control what we think about, but we have to get into the habit of policing our own thoughts and saying, no, I won't allow my mind to go there. This helps us develop a carefulness about outside messages we hear from so-called leaders. We must learn to examine what we hear and think in the context of biblical principles because Yah will allow deceptive things to happen to test our vigilance and attentiveness to his instructions, as he did with Ahab, king of Israel. This particular story about King Ahab revealed an unfortunate situation that happened in his life because of his insistence of doing things his way and giving ear to false prophets controlled by seducing spirits. The following story about the folly of Ahab and the influence of ungodly seducing spirits around him provides a very good example of what should be carefully considered in regard to Martin Luther King Jr. and other so-called leaders who may have compromised minds. The story goes like this. One day, Israel's king Ahab was convinced that going to war against the Syrians was something that needed to be done, so he requested that the king of Judah join him in the battle to make sure his success. King Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, thought it would be wise to inquire of Yah whether this venture of war with the king of Israel would be successful. So Jehoshaphat asked Ahab to call all his prophets to see what the word of Yah would be. 400 prophets turned out to prophesy. They all told the king that they would be successful in their war campaign against the Syrians. However, Jehoshaphat was not satisfied with the unanimous report of Ahab's troop of prophets, so he inquired of Ahab if there was anyone else known for being a prophet of Yah who he could inquire of. As it turned out, there was a particular prophet named Micaiah, but King Ahab hated him because he did not prophesy good things concerning him. However, Ahab, willing to honor the request of Jehoshaphat, brought Micaiah in to see what he would prophesy according to the word of Yah. Surprisingly, Micaiah said unto the kings, Go ye up and prosper, and they shall be delivered into your hands. 2 Chronicles 18:14. But something didn't seem right. Since when did this prophet give the king good news? Ahab must have felt that the prophet was not being completely honest, because the following verses indicate that it was demanded of Micaiah that he tell nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord. He agreed and said, I did see all Israel scattered upon the mountains as a sheep that have no shepherd. Verse 16. This prophecy of doom was precisely what Ahab was trying to get Jehoshaphat to see about this particular prophet. Micaiah never prophesied good concerning him. But more importantly than that grim pronouncement, Yah had something else for Micaiah to reveal to King Ahab. What the prophet told the king next should have caused him to stop dead in his tracks, reconsider what he was planning, and humble himself before Yah. This lone and despised prophet called their attention to the words of Yah and said, Therefore, hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting upon his throne, and all the host of heaven standing on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who shall entice Ahab, king of Israel, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one spake, saying after this manner, and another saying after that manner. Then there came out a spirit and stood before the Lord, and said, I will entice him. And the Lord said unto him, Wherewith? And he said, I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And the Lord said, Thou shalt entice him, and thou shalt also prevail. Go out and do even so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord hath put a lying spirit in the mouth of these thy prophets, and the Lord hath spoken evil against thee. 2 Chronicles 18:18 through 22. Now that was a revelation. Yah would allow Ahab to be deceived and killed. It wasn't that Micaiah had anything personal against Ahab. He was simply showing that Yah abhorred Ahab's evil ways. If Ahab did not want the truth, he would get lies suggested by evil seducing spirits that would lead him ultimately to his death. Because of that story, I was led to ask the question, did Yah allow Martin Luther King Jr. to be enticed by seducing spirits via the control mechanisms of the Roman invisible government? Was King under their influence while acting in the capacity of leader and prophet for black people and ultimately the nation? King talked about a unique spiritual experience he had one night during the Montgomery boycotts. He and his family had been threatened by angry whites and told to leave town. He felt himself becoming weak and fearful, and he decided religion had to become real to him, and he had to know God for himself. He began to pray, and then it happened. It seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you, even unto the end of the world. I heard the voice of Jesus saying still to fight on. He promised to never leave me, never to leave me alone. Whose voice had King really heard? Could it have been the voice of a seducing, lying spirit telling him to fight on? We know that King was fighting for equality with black people's oppressors, and that goal contradicted what Yah had already revealed through the former prophets. Yah said that his people would suffer at the hand of oppressors until they returned unto him with all their heart and soul and was obedient to all that he had commanded. Deuteronomy 30, verse 2. If the voice King heard was a seducing spirit encouraging him to fight on, alarm bells should be going off in everyone's mind concerning the spirits behind the civil rights movement. These evil spirits were in a desperate struggle to sidetrack black people with vain thoughts of throwing off the shackles of oppression and inequality rather than realizing, as the patriarch Dan, the son of Jacob, prophesied. Therefore is the enemy eager to destroy all that call upon the Lord, for he knoweth that on the day on which Israel shall repent, the kingdom of the enemy shall be brought to an end. It is literally that simple. The enemy was and is bombarding the mind of the people with oppressor-made problems and oppressor-made solutions so that those targeted never think to call upon Yah's name to obtain the deliverance they so desperately needed. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about zeitgeist, or the spirit of the times. I wondered about zeitgeist and why it was associated with the civil rights movement. Wikipedia.org says that zeitgeist is of German origin and refers to the general cultural, intellectual, ethical, spiritual, or political climate within a nation, with, with the general ambiance, morals, cultural direction, and mood associated with that era. Concerning the 1,600,000,000 people of color in the world, King saw their efforts to resist Western domination as part of a global mood that reflected the spirit of the times. However, that spirit was not recognized for what it really was. Satan, the god of this world, was behind the zeitgeist spirit for the purpose of blinding the minds of the people with desires to fight for peace and harmony in a world terribly corrupted and destined for destruction. The civil rights movement leaders did not seem to consider the truth that Satan's worldly dominion, which includes Rome's most valuable storefront, the United States, is at war with Yeshua's kingdom and facing impending doom. The spiritual forces driving world leaders to think that they were solving problems led them to promote ways that caused people to think was right, but in reality has led many into deeper, more secure forms of bondage. Yeshua pre-warned that he did not come to send peace on earth, but a sword. Matthew 10:34. He said that he would give believers inner peace, but not to expect peace in the world. John 14:27. Yeshua forewarned that from the time that he went back to heaven and the time he returns, world conditions would increasingly deteriorate no matter what world leaders promised or conjured up. Luke 21:9 through 36, 1 Thessalonians 5:3. Believers in Yah's Son, Yeshua, can never allow themselves to be influenced by individuals taking their cues from the spirits of this world. It contradicts the instructions of Yeshua and reflects a fickle world's mood. The world wanted to fight against oppression, and black people who did not know Yeshua got caught up in the fight without critically analyzing what spirit was motivating them and why they were being stirred up. This ungodly spirit sought to distract people from crying out to Yah for help so that they would understand what they were dealing with. It is a fact that seducing spirits are always standing by to deceive those who are seeking a better way. Since those seeking a better way did not do their due diligence, they have fallen for the strong delusions that promote the thinking that black people have and can overcome great odds to achieve equality and the American dream that King so enchantingly spoke about. The mountaintop experience that Yeshua had with Satan appeared to be repeated with Martin Luther King Jr. But instead of refusing Satan's temporal kingdom, King accepted the offer that encapsulated equality, integration, economic opportunities, educational opportunities, and upward social mobility. The sad truth is that you cannot accept Satan's supposed benefits without getting burned in the process. Satan is a con man, and anything he offers demands a sacrifice greater than what one expects. You always end up giving away, unknowingly, something of greater value when you interact with a con man. When Satan, either directly or indirectly, presented King with visions of obtaining the promised land, he was beguiling King with illusions intended to draw people away from Yeshua's kingdom to the support of his corrupted earthly kingdom. Satan used all of his wiles to enamor Yeshua with his glamorous offer of world kingdoms, but Yeshua was not deceived by the power and glories and riches that flashed before him, nor would he recognize Satan as one worthy of worship and honor, but instead firmly responded, "Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve." Matthew 4:10. Yeshua was not going to bow down himself and worship Satan by acknowledging and accepting his power and wealth. Satan was and is the leader of rebellious evil spirits that are hell bent on leading foolish individuals astray. In the book of Ezekiel, Yah wanted his people to understand that if the prophet be deceived when he hath spoken a thing, I, the Lord, have deceived that prophet, and I will stretch out my hand upon him, and will destroy him from the midst of my people Israel. And they shall bear the punishment of their iniquity. The punishment of the prophet shall be even as the punishment of him that seeketh unto him, that the house of Israel may go no more astray from me, neither be polluted any more with all their transgressions, but that they may be my people, and I may be their Yah, saith the Lord. Ezekiel 14:9-11. Anyone speaking of any other way beside the way that Yah has already shown for his people to walk in should be recognized as a deceiver or someone who has been deceived. When Satan commissions seducing spirits to do a particular work, the objective is to subtly draw away, confuse, deceive a person from following the established way of Yah outlined in the scriptures. An indication of Satan's seduction is the person's state of mind and spirit. They will reveal an indifference to biblical truths that are inherently liberating, and as a result fail to recognize Yah's Son or his mighty power. Seducing spirits do an effective work on those who don't know Yah by flattering them of the superiority of their reasoning powers and their ability to discern things with their senses. These ones always have an excuse as to why the words of Yah cannot be applied to all the affairs of modern life, or they misapply his word. However, we cannot be deterred by such individuals. In time, they will reap what they have sown. Conjure. In this next section, I wanted to go a step beyond what we have already discussed to consider 3 other areas of human activity that provide examples of seducing spirits in operation to actively influence the human mind against Yah. We will journey into the past and look briefly at conjure, propaganda, and hypnotic programming and determine their possible connection to King in the Civil Rights Movement. An aspect of Black American history that I was initially unfamiliar with was the presence of conjure in slave religion. What made me stop and take notice was the role and purpose of conjure in the slave quarters and its relationship with Christianity. Within the background of American slavery are aspects of history that will perhaps shed light on some of the reasons for the success of the Civil Rights Movement and why King was so revered and loved by many. The question that stayed on my mind was why Black people, for the most part, were able to work together en masse during the time of the Civil Rights Movement, but have not been able to come together since to work out the problems they continue to face. David L. Chappelle, in his book A Stone of Hope, expressed a similar sentiment. Yet there remains a mystery about what happened in the 1950s and 1960s. From the Middle Passage on, African Americans had struggled, but this one time they overcame. Since the 1960s, Black people have not experienced another overcoming such as claimed by 20th century civil rights leaders. Why is this? How can so many of the same problems still exist if Black people truly overcame 50 plus years ago? Something just doesn't add up. This is why I am exploring these areas. I wanted to enlarge my perspective as I investigated what made King and the Civil Rights Movement so successful on a grassroots level. There are two authors I found who dealt extensively with slave religion and the presence of the conjure tradition in their books, Slave Religion and Black Magic. Albert J. Rabatow and Yvonne P. Chiriow both explore the meaning and purpose of conjure among the slaves in an interesting but scholarly manner. To begin with, conjure was, according to Rabatow, a theory which made sense of the mysterious and inexplicable occurrences of life. Those things ranged from illnesses and death to racial injustices. Chiriow pointed out how defenses against the psychological and physical assaults of slavery were essential for many African Americans who endured a system in which their humanity was devalued and their collective efforts at self-determination were constantly hindered. Slaves used conjure for many things, but its most salient functional value for Blacks had to do with practices of racial opposition. Conjure was a way to access and harness supernatural power in the here and now. Slave preachers were foremost in the fight against oppression, but the conjurer added complexity to the slave preacher's life in a key way. Rabatow said that the conjurer was the preacher's chief rival for authority of a supernatural kind. In fact, he said the strongest other religious force in the quarters was conjure. Conjure beliefs served the needs of the slaves' most immediate needs, like placing and removing fixes or spells, healings, etc. Like Christianity, conjure was a system of belief, a method of control. First, the control which comes from knowledge, being able to explain crucial phenomena such as illness, misfortune, and evil. Second, the control which comes from the capacity to act effectively. Third, a means of control over the future through reading the signs. Fourth, an aid to social control because it supplied a system whereby conflict, otherwise stifled, could be aired. Christianity, as Black people came to know it, as given them by their oppressors, did not deal per se with the pressing issues that conjure seemed positioned to deal with. As a result of this, I wondered if there was a possibility of merging the two for better results. Rabatow thought that conjurers, who were also ministers, was an intriguing possibility, although he did not find evidence of it. Chiriow, on the other hand, saw two of the best known slave conspiracies in the United States, that of Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina, 1822, and Nate Turner in Southampton County, Virginia, 1831, as men who gave expression to powerful impulses of supernaturalism and spiritual harming. I was curious to know if these conjure traditions outlived slavery and if they could be found at the turn of the 20th century and beyond. Chiriow described the changes the conjurer underwent due to the great migration of blacks from the plantation South to the northern cities. Aside from the spiritualists, a variety of supernatural specialists took their places within black American urban communities in the first few decades of the 20th century. The rise of these individuals marked a shift in the roles of the former slave conjurer and roots doctor. For many of these individuals, supernatural work was a ministry, and their titles, recast to reflect a sacred vocation, were transformed into reverend and prophet. Although for the most part Christian denominations distanced themselves from the surfeit of supernatural merchandisers, in the cities Christian ministers and religious practitioners sometimes doubled as proprietors of magic and occult businesses. The conjurer's power to fix and remove fixes, to cause harm and to cure, led the slaves and later freedmen to believe that it was possible to locate the source of misfortune and control it. This set the conjurer up to be able to This set the conjurer up to be able to profit largely from his influential position in the community. To show that they were important and needed, conjurers cultivated an aura of mystery which lent credibility to their reputations as men familiar with supernatural lore. Whatever uniquenesses they could seize upon, they used to its fullest extent. When we consider King from this perspective, the unique part of his persona was his extensive vocabulary and the ability to use his voice and words to mesmerize his listeners. He mastered the art of public speaking and learned to read his audiences and give them exactly what they wanted. King was able to masterfully articulate for Black people their desire for social equality and improve race relations, and he did it with such sophistication and eloquence that whatever he said that was questionable or against the teachings of Scripture was either glossed over or ignored. All that mattered was that Black people finally felt they had someone to articulate their grievances and present them to the nation. Black people were convinced that King had the power to present a persuasive moral appeal that would cause the white power structure to change its evil ways. Referring back to the Vesey conspiracy for parallels to King's work, we notice that Vesey used religious faith to consolidate his sympathizers and provided the Charleston uprising with a spiritual impetus that secular ideology did not supply. Religion became both a tool and a motivating force. King rallied his followers in a manner similar to Vesey. He used scripture passages to support the effort of correcting the ills of the Negro through social justice. Interestingly, supernaturalism or conjure spoke directly in areas that Christian theology did not clearly address: the indeterminate territory between right and wrong, the hazy, gray field of situation-specific ethics and actions. For King and many Black people, the hazy and gray areas that were not addressed by Christianity were the unusual and distressing circumstances of racial injustices they continuously found themselves battling against. The fact that King, as a preacher, was more concerned with the fight against racial inequalities than with focusing on how scripture truth could help black people properly interpret their situation was a glaring problem that has continued to be overlooked until this day. How King was related to by those closest to him reveals quite a bit, even suggesting a cult of personality. When King worked with the religious and civil rights leaders, he was nicknamed by the younger civil rights activists from SNCC as De Lord. According to Stuart Burns in his book To the Mountaintop, sometimes during meetings, King would excuse himself, go into another room, and pray on the decision at hand. When he returned, Abernathy would pronounce with biblical pomp that the word of God was about to be spoken, and King would reveal to them what God had told him. No one was willing to gainsay or second guess the Lord. It was not a coincidence that many people related to King as if he were a Messiah. The, the thought did not occur to people that they were responding to a charismatic phenomenon created by seducing spirits/demons. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. 2 Corinthians 11:14 and 15. King's public persona stimulated a type of reaction that celebrities regularly receive, and he took advantage of the people's heightened emotional state to influence them with his goals. From a revolutionary liberator standpoint, causing people to act based on emotions is an absolute no-no. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, wrote, "Those who work for liberation must not take advantage of the emotional dependence of the oppressed, dependence that is the fruit of the concrete situation of domination which surrounds them. Using their dependence to create still greater dependence is an oppressor tactic." The preferred method, Freire observed, was to allow the oppressed the opportunity to think and act for themselves, no matter how long it took. Seducing evil spirits are extremely opposed to any efforts tending towards the liberation of those they have worked to enslave. As a countermeasure to prevent escape, evil spirits use the power of suggestion, either of the media or some other medium, to focus oppressed people's attention on the charismatic person or the perceived authority, causing them to believe that that person will lead them to the freedom they are seeking. Seducing spirits work hard to prevent people from engaging in critical thinking and reflection from a proper perspective, which happens to be one of the prerequisites in the fight for freedom. Keep in mind, though, that critical thinking must be guided by the wisdom of the scriptures if one is to escape the snares of crafty men. The scriptures affirm that those who are mature in the word have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Hebrews 5:14. In order for the scriptures to be the guide that Yah intended it to be, its instructions and principles cannot be viewed carelessly or from the standpoint that they are not applicable for our times or that they must be made to adapt to our modern way of thinking. The Bible is a compilation of prophetic books that provide instructions and principles that transcend time, culture, place, and circumstances. Seducing spirits stand waiting for anyone who dares to believe otherwise. Propaganda. King's connection to those who crafted carefully prepared propaganda to direct the minds of the American people to accept certain ideas and solutions suggests a relationship between strange bedfellows. The level of exposure King received from the American media was enormous and out of the ordinary. The American public, the American public relations cabal, who were bent on shaping public's perception according to their desires, appeared to be quite successful in promoting King and civil rights. This group of public relations experts were using propaganda in their media content as weapons against the people for the purpose of molding the people's thinking. For over a century, they have been very successful influencing the public's mind without the public's knowledge. They have coerced the American people into action on many things from a non thinking, reactionary, or emotional standpoint. King was part of this effort when he repeatedly called for Americans to fight for freedom. Americans were not given the privilege to analyze, reflect, and define for themselves what freedom meant. Again, as Paulo Freire noted, true liberation leaders must trust in the oppressed and their ability to reason, and refuse to use propaganda as a tool for motivating action in the oppressed. Satan's Roman predators have expended tremendous resources in refining media propaganda as a weapon of war against the masses. They have learned that they can manipulate the common people of all nationalities and cultures using specialized psychological tools to influence how people perceive and think about the world. The masses are viewed as cattle that must be herded in right directions so that they can make right decisions. This modern form of people herding is called public opinion and is mainly formed by surveys, opinion polls, and media content. These things are carefully created and managed by a team of public relation experts and psychologists who understand how to manipulate information to get a specific response or outcome from people. I am a member of the masses who have been affected by these modern information cowboys, and I am insulted by the fact that someone somewhere is constantly seeking to decide for me what I should think and how I should act concerning things happening in my world because they think I am incapable of coming to right conclusions. But it's not really about coming to right conclusions. It's about coming to the conclusion that the illumined Roman predators want you to come to. One of the things that I questioned early on in my research was whether civil rights and the fight for racial equality in this country evolved naturally, or was it a predetermined political propaganda campaign effort that reflected the Roman predators' desire to move American society in a certain direction. Was King a charismatic preacher who happened to be in the right place at the right time, or was he someone who was groomed to play a prominent role in the changing of American society? I remember during my research finding a quote from Franklin Roosevelt that said, "In politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way." I have often wondered how broadly that fact can be applied. Can there be social changes brought about that are made to appear as if they sprung up naturally among people as they try to deal with their problems? Can people be used to bring about change that does not ultimately benefit them? After my research on public opinion and propaganda, which is nothing more than psychological warfare, my understanding of Revelation chapter 12 and 13 was taken to a deeper level when I realized what Satan, through his Romanized instrumentalities, have been doing for a long time. They have relied heavily on disinformation and psychological warfare to oppress and destroy peoples of every nation. This is how Satan prefers to wage war undetected. As chief of the seducing spirits, Satan hates with all malice the thought of human beings made in the image of Yah having the opportunity to escape his tyranny and turn to challenge his wicked domination. Seducing spirits work tirelessly and skillfully to deceive people into believing good is happening in this world when the opposite is true. All this is done to keep people in the game, so to speak. Satan works through his chosen human agents to wage sophisticated psychological warfare on those who would, under normal circumstances, recognize his mode of operation and challenge him. Satan is not beneath borrowing from the divine template to make things appear to be righteous or beneficial. If Satan can convince enough oppressed people that things are improving for them and mankind in general, and that there really is no need to be concerned about anything, then he knows oppressed people's defenses will be lowered and they will not be prepared for his more advanced deceptions. If psychological warfare ever loses its power, though, Satan will not hesitate to turn to vicious force as a means to maintain control over the minds and bodies of black people and all other oppressed people of the earth. The threat of destitution, imprisonment, and death are excellent motivators to keep any people in line with Satan's one world order agenda. We are told in Revelation that these are the things that Satan will do as his reign of terror draws to an end. Demonic activity is going into high gear, and we need Yeshua's Spirit to guide us through the landmines of false leaders and false or misleading information. It is quite interesting that during the period of the 50s and 60s, the black infrastructure was slowly and painfully built after slavery was systematically being dismantled in the name of desegregation, which brought about the freedoms of integration. This could not have happened without the use of the press and its well-crafted propaganda. Seducing spirits use their henchmen slash conmen to promote enticing words to influence the minds of millions of people to trade their wealth for empty ideals. In other words, black people were conned into trading their something for nothing. In fact, I find it more than a coincidence that the protocols of Zion say, "There is a great force that creates the movement of thought in the people, and that is the press. It has fallen into our hands." Protocol 2. We shall be in a position to excite or tranquilize the public mind on political questions, to persuade or to confuse, printing now truth, now lies. If there should be any found who are desirous of writing against us, they will not find any person eager to print their productions. Publisher or printer will have to apply to the authorities for permission. Literature and journalism are two of the most important educative forces, and therefore our government will become proprietor of the majority of the journals. This will neutralize the injurious influence of the privately owned press. This, however, must in no wise be suspected by the public. Protocol 12. The Roman Catholic Church hierarchy also had some similar things to say about the press. In fact, their statements caused me to wonder if they were the real writers of the Protocols of Zion, or better, were illuminated Jews and Catholics one and the same, but showing two different faces like the Roman Janus head. Anyway, in 1964, Pope Paul VI amplified Miranda Prostros with the decree Inter Mirifica among wonders, saying it is the Church's birthright to use and own the press, the cinema, radio, television, and others of a like nature for their purposes, so that they could successfully bring human understanding into papal subservience through esoteric emotional experiences. This is extremely important to keep in mind when looking at King and the highly publicized civil rights movement. The involvement of wealthy Jews and Roman Catholics with others they had influenced through Greek fraternities, secret societies, and public relations spin doctors suggested that they were the power brokers behind the scenes who wanted American society changed. Let's be very clear that it had nothing to do with eliminating Negro suffering. Black people's misery and mistreatment were used as pretexts to make laws that helped extract American wealth and move the masses towards global citizenship. The predators who lust for the absolute power of ancient Rome before it fell wanted a unified public mind controlled by uniform laws that would make the management and indoctrination of the masses with global dogmas easier. Once indoctrinated, the masses are expected to consent to the mark of the beast, which makes them an official global citizen of the one world order. One of the obstacles these empire builders faced were the prescribed racial attitudes of white Americans towards black people and other people of color. The reason I say prescribed is that the racial attitudes of white Americans had been changed in the past by outside forces to keep them in check with the desires of the colonial Roman European predators. The white American masses have been manipulated to a far greater extent than what is known, and part of this tragedy is part of this tragedy is noted by Tim Wise in his book White Like Me. I want to quote two paragraphs that shed light on this seemingly unknown fact. But the notion of the white race found traction in the North American colonies not because it described a clear scientific concept or some true historical bond between persons of European descent, but rather because of the elites of the colonies who were small in number but controlled the vast majority of colonial wealth. They needed a way to secure their power. At the time, the wealthy landowners feared rebellion in which poor European peasants might join with African slaves to overthrow the aristocratic governance. After all, these poor Europeans were barely above the level of slaves themselves, especially if they worked as indentured servants. As mentioned earlier, from the mid-1600s to the early 1700s, a series of laws were promulgated in Virginia and elsewhere which elevated all persons of European descent, no matter how lowly in economic terms, above all persons of African descent. The purpose of such measures was to provide poor Europeans, increasingly called whites, with a stake in the system, even though they were hardly benefiting in material terms from it. In other words, whiteness was a trick, and it worked marvelously, dampening down the push for rebellion by poor whites on the basis of class interests and encouraging them to cast their lot with the elite, if only in aspirational terms. White skin became, for them, an alternative form of property to which they could cleave in the absence of more tangible possessions. Former President Lyndon B. Johnson once said, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you." Wealthy colonial Catholics and Jews successfully used the time-proven tactic of divide and conquer to cause poor and working-class whites to adopt a self-destructive mentality in regards to blacks and other people of color based on the superficial concept of the superiority of white skin. At the turn of the 20th century, however, these predators needed the white masses to adjust their thinking again. They needed white people to adjust their counterproductive segregationist attitudes and behaviors that stood in the way of the next phase of global unification and democracy. Edward Bernays, the Jewish American nephew of Sigmund Freud, was the man for the job and is considered by many to be the father of American public relations. He got his start by helping the American government win the support of the American people for World War I. He spun information so effectively that the American people were led to change their isolationist position, meaning they believed in minding their own business and not getting involved in other nations' affairs, and enter the war. Americans were further manipulated to view President Wilson as a hero after the war. Bernays was thrilled with how easy it was to influence public opinion during the war and wondered if the same results could be had in times of peace. He quickly found out that he could, like Joseph Goebbels, the German propagandist who worked for Hitler, move the American people at will to do the bidding of private, corporate, and government interests. I find this intriguing because I discovered several civil rights organizations with interesting financial backings. These financiers supported the effort for finding ways to quote unquote improve the plight of black people. They seem to always have access to traitorous black men and women who would help them in their improvement scheme. Black America appeared to have no protective hedge about it that prevented outspoken and talented blacks from being used as tools by the Roman predators to bring about social and political change. It is a not so well known fact that many civil rights organizations and black colleges and universities were founded and funded by the white power structure. For example, Spelman College was founded and named after John D. Rockefeller's in-laws in honor of the visionaries who wanted to see a women's college started for Negro women. Oh, how noble and generous, right? Wrong. Black women were intentionally targeted for indoctrination to ensure that they would continue to support the American corporate status quo. From these educational institutions set up for blacks, a new breed of blacks arose contaminated by Greek and Western philosophy. Those most promising to the Roman predators filled the ranks of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the talented tenth. From this special group of talented black Greeks, we find familiar names like Martin Luther King, Benjamin Mays, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Thurgood Marshall. Men like these were precisely what the white power structure wanted. It was these individuals who would support the agenda of social change and help the predators maintain control over black people and their collective resources. The influence of these black Greeks successfully introduced contradictory elements into black thinking that would act as a divider and corrupter. The Roman predators' power knew that if they controlled black American education and the leaders it produced, they could control the black masses and move them in whatever direction they desired. In 1928, Edward Bernays wrote a book entitled Propaganda. In it, he said, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power in this country. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world." Edward Bernays was extremely sought after for his expertise in public relations propaganda and did further consulting for government men like Presidents Roosevelt and Eisenhower, American Tobacco Company, NAACP, General Motors, United States Information Agency, United Fruit Company, now Chiquita, and a host of others. What caught my eye in this partial list was the work Bernays did for the NAACP. What did he do for the NAACP? As it turns out, There's a museum of public relations which provides valuable information about the work Bernays did for the NAACP. Here is an excerpt of what I found. When author B. Spingarn, New York lawyer and National Association for the Advancement of Colored People founder, asked Edward Bernays to handle publicity for the 1920 Regional Convention in Atlanta, the respectful term for black people was Negro, although not too many people were using it. Affecting a major attitudinal change was to be a terrific challenge. The goals of the campaign were to use the Atlanta Convention as a springboard for publicity to make the South and the North realize that we are in earnest in battling for the civil rights of the Negro. These rights were considered revolutionary: abolish lynching, segregation, and Jim Crow railroad cars, and obtain equal education, industrial opportunities, and voting rights. Holding the NAACP conference in Atlanta was startling to say the least, according to the New York Times. While Bernays began contacting northern newspapers and press services offering to cover the convention for them, his associate and future wife, Doris Fleischman, went to Atlanta to recruit Georgia's elected officials to attend the conference and show their support. In Atlanta, Fleischman was threatened by the people opposed to Negro rights, and the politicians were unnerved. The governor told her that he couldn't attend the conference because he had to go duck hunting. She suggested that it might be a good idea to have the militia stand by in case of violence. He agreed. By the time Bernays arrived from New York, the community was filled with tension and there were repeated threats of mass violence. Unintimidated, Bernays and Fleischman outlined three themes to the media. First, the Negro's importance to the economic development of the South. Bernays said this approach was based on an appeal to their white people's fear of losing profits if migration of workers persisted. Second, the less tolerant attitudes of some Southern leaders toward Negroes, which would hopefully strengthen the nucleus of supporters and develop a bandwagon movement. Third, the support of the NAACP by important leaders in the North to induce Southern group leaders to follow their lead. Bernays had gathered statements from North leaders which he promoted in the press. The conference was held without incident, and delegates to the conference voted to send their objectives to President Wilson and to Congress. Media coverage was impressive. Atlanta's newspaper, the New York Globe, the Evening Post, the Chicago Daily, and others carried stories about the meeting and a feature outlining progress made by Negroes from the plantation labor to business and the professions. For the first time in the history of the country, Bernays said, under the dateline of the South's industrial metropolis, news was published throughout the country alerting the people of the United States that whites and Negroes alike were seeking a new status for the Negro. Take notice of the statement affecting a major attitudinal change was to be a terrific challenge and seeking new status for the Negro. Not only were white people targeted for attitudinal change, black people were also targeted too. King also felt that changes in American attitudes were necessary for progress. But was he willing to let them evolve naturally, or was he in favor of the various forms of psycho-behavioral manipulation? Although black people were eager for change, the Roman predators needed their attitudes to be remolded and shaped to conform to the American group mind that was being created. Edward Bernays was not shy in stating that the invisible government pulled the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. Emphasis mine. The cunning deception of Satan's illumined Roman predators and their spokesmen in regards to black and white Americans during the first half of the 20th century was a strong sign of their connection to the God of this world, who was showcasing his brilliance and deceptive mastermind capabilities. Yes, Satan is the mastermind behind the Roman predators' work to bring about a one world government. Apart from him, these predators are nothing. Satan's powerful influence can be seen in all the forms of deception used by the Roman predators. If you think it's easy to spot his deceptions, you are sadly mistaken. The following statement should make anyone think twice about the things they have seen and heard in any form of mass communication. Although manipulative, propaganda is not necessarily untruthful, as is commonly believed. In fact, many specialists believe that the most effective propaganda employs different layers of truth, from half-truths to truth out of context to the just plain truth. Propaganda that is based on fact and that rings true to the intended audience is more likely to be persuasive than bald-faced lies. This is where commitment to divine wisdom acts as a guard against such sly assaults. Proverb says, there is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Proverbs 16:25. The key thought here is that the senses can be manipulated to relay information to the mind that seems right but isn't. That is why scripture principles must be followed carefully above our natural inclinations. Our senses and natural inclinations can betray us, and evil spirits fully exploit that to their advantage. The scriptures tell us to take heed and not be deceived. We have been warned about our enemies and how they operate. He that dissembles with his lips and lays up deceit within himself, when he speaks fair, believe him not. For there are 7 abominations in his heart, whose hatred is covered by deceit. His wickedness shall be showed before the whole congregation. Proverbs 26:24 through 26. Proverbs 6:16 through 19 tells what those 7 abominations are. Hypnotism. Seducing, lying spirits have marvelous fun at the expense of the unwise and unsuspecting. They wreak all kinds of havoc when people are not aware of them or their devices. The scripture tells us that we are not to be ignorant of Satan's devices. We cannot afford to take these lying spirits for granted just because we can't see them. We should understand that they hate us. Although we can't see them, we can and should know the way and how they work. They have shown that they prefer to select ungodly human agents who either love gain or are in positions of power and wealth to influence and control those within their reach. Therefore, I wanted to know whether hypnotism was also used by the demon-controlled Roman predators to ensure that King and the Civil Rights Movement experienced success. I know it is far easier to get cooperation from people by bypassing the part of their brain responsible for critical thinking. Could this bypass be accomplished without the public's awareness? It just so happened that a budding technology called television was being used extensively during the early days of the Civil Rights Movement. Television successfully brought powerful moving images of black protest and white resistance in the South to people all over the United States and the rest of the world. The scenes presented had a tremendous impact on the world. Years earlier, researchers had discovered through their experiments with radio that people could be made to believe anything if it was put to them correctly. A perfect example was Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast of 1938. It was so convincing and realistic that many Americans became frightened and called the authorities to see if they were really being attacked by aliens from Mars. Researchers later found with television, they could not only cause people to believe things, they could control their behavior through powerful visual suggestions. Studies showed that after a few minutes of watching television, a particular part of a person's brain shuts down and goes into what is called alpha brainwave mode. These are slow, extended brain waves that indicated to researchers that the area of the brain used for critical thinking and problem solving was being bypassed. When the brain is actively processing information, it produces quick, short brain wave activity called beta waves. Watching certain television content causes the brain to slow down and become nearly inactive. This produces a trance-like hypnotic state where people are more open to receive thoughts and suggestions that come to them whether they are aware of them or not. Maybe this is why there is such thing as continuous television programming. Maybe this is why people are addicted to their televisions and find it hard to turn them off. The Roman predators want the masses constantly infused with their propaganda and their brains shut down or overwhelmed to prevent critical thinking about the world they live in. I remember hearing a man talk about his experience as a boy when he heard Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech on television. He said that he remembered being so riveted and mesmerized by King's words that his life was never the same after. There have been others that have been so impacted by King's speeches that they have been motivated to memorize and reenact them annually during Black History Month to show their devotion to their fallen hero. Because of the programming and their emotional attachment, they cannot tolerate critical discussion of King and the Civil Rights Movement. That, in and of itself, is strong evidence that their unconscious mind has been affected by subtle programming. The best way I have found to safely and gently break the hold of this imperceptible malicious programming of the mind is to engage in proper scripture reading and study. The scriptures effectively changes the conversation by causing the mind to actively engage in topics pre-selected by Yah. Dwelling on biblical themes unhampered with flawed human commentary or suppositions allows the mind to recalibrate and heal. There is a rough period a person goes through when making the transition. This is seen in the initial reluctance to engage in the reading of the Bible. The mind, so accustomed to being in a hypnotic, controlled state, seeks what is familiar. The Bible is not familiar. It seems to be difficult to understand. The Bible feels boring and doesn't fit the idea of what is necessary or desirable to do. This initial pushback from the Bible is an expected response. But if a person really wants to know if this process works, they will push through the negative internal reactions and keep reading. In fact, the negativity that surrounds the idea of engaging in Bible reading doesn't take long to disappear once a person sets his or her mind to do it and actually does it. This is, in my experience, the most gentle and effective way to break the psychological chains that enemies use to control the mind. In addition to the therapeutic effects of the scriptures, one begins to learn about the creator of the world and his enduring love for it and them. Once the mind has had time to rest and heal, it can better evaluate the world around and realize that the creator has given the best route to walk in this journey called life.